Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today for the panel discussion, Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture. I'm Joni Albrecht, Director of the John Marshall Center for Constitutional History and Civics here at the museum. And before I introduce our speakers, I have just a few announcements. First, September is Virginia Spirits Month, and the VMHC is celebrating in fine tradition with the return of our Virginia Distilled Festival this Saturday, September 9th at 6 p.m. The event will feature spirits produced by distillers from around the Commonwealth with live music, food trucks, after-hours access to the museum's newest exhibition, Apollo. Next Monday, September 11th, VMHC members can enjoy a relaxing evening at the Virginia House Gardens. I hope you'll join us for live jazz at our Members Monday event. You do need to register and also plan to bring a blanket and picnic. And finally, here in the forum next Thursday, Gregory May will present on his new book, A Madman's Will, John Randolph, 400 Slaves, and the Mirage of Freedom. You can find out more about all of these events by visiting our website, virginiahistory.org. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's esteemed panelists. Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky is Senior Fellow at the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. She is a historian of the presidency, political culture, and the government, especially the President's Cabinet. Lindsay is the author of The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution, and the co-editor with fellow panelist Matthew Costello of Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture. Dr. Matthew Costello is the Vice President and Interim Director of the David M. Rubenstein Center at the White House Historical Association. He previously worked on the George Washington Bibliography Project for the George Washington Papers at the University of Virginia. His first book, The Property of the Nation, George Washington's Tomb, Mount Vernon, and the Memory of the First President, was a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. And Dr. Jeffrey Engel is professor and director for the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. Jeff is an award-winning scholar and teacher and an expert on the U.S. presidency and American diplomatic history. He taught at the University of Pennsylvania and Texas A&M before moving to SMU. He has written or edited 6 books, including Into the Desert, Reflections on the Gulf War, The Fall of the Berlin Wall, The Revolutionary Legacy of 1989, and the China Diary of George H.W. Bush, The Making of a Global President. George also contributed to Mourning the Presidents. And now will you join me in welcoming our panelists for today's discussion.
Well, thank you so much to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture for having us and for that lovely introduction. We're really excited to be here and to share this with you. Of course, there is a good smattering of Virginia presidents in this volume, as there should be. I think a good place to start, and where we usually start this volume, is to think about where it came from and why we did it. It's a rather unusual topic. And so, Matt, perhaps you could start by sharing with the audience how it is that we came up with this idea and why we decided it would be a good one.
Sure. So, Lindsay was formerly my colleague at the association, and in 2018, the country saw the passing of both a former First Lady in Barbara Bush, and then later that year, the passing of former President George H.W. Bush. And so throughout that year, we sort of went through it twice, but there was a lot of public interest, media interest in funerals of First Ladies, state funerals of former presidents. What does that look like? What are those traditions? What is that history? But then more importantly, as we were sort of commenting on these things, but also having sidebars and speaking amongst ourselves, sort of taking a long look at that dialogue. How is George H.W. Bush being remembered right now at this moment? And thinking about how that will change moving forward. And what Lindsay and I both observed was that it seemed as though certainly, you can talk about George H.W. Bush's accomplishments, from his time as a pilot all the way up to his service as the 41st president of the United States and everything in between. But it seemed as though that there was a special emphasis placed more on his character. And, from our perspective, it seemed like it was more or less being used as a means, as a foil to compare George H.W. Bush with then the current president of the United States, Donald Trump. And so we became interested then in this question of presidential passing, that immediate period of mourning. So how do Americans from all different types of backgrounds respond to that historic passing? And then how does that conversation evolve over time? What people choose to remember when a president passes versus 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later. How do we measure that? How do we analyze that? And that is what gave birth to this volume. And we detailed 12 different presidents, some of them passing in office, some of them passing after leaving office, but also looking at how those deaths impacted Americans and then how their legacy has evolved and changed since then.
And the way we went about putting it together is we wanted to make sure, both Matt and I originally were trained as 18th and early 19th century historians. And so we were reminding our colleagues that indeed the 19th century does exist. And so we really wanted to have some chronological balance. We wanted to make sure it wasn't just a 20th century volume or a 21st century volume. We wanted to make sure, of course, you had to have presidents like Lincoln and Kennedy, because if you're talking about presidential death and mourning, how do you leave out Lincoln and Kennedy? But we didn't want to be repeating what everyone else had said, and we wanted to offer something new and to make sure we were covering some of the presidents that maybe people didn't know as much about, or a part of the story that they didn't know as much about, so that we were contributing something new. And lastly, we wanted to make sure that we acknowledge that the people who participate in the writing of history, the crafting of memory and legacy, are not just historians or journalists, but they're professors and they're people working at presidential libraries. They are graduate students and public historians. And so we wanted to make sure we had balance of people who were coming at it from a lot of different angles. And I didn't tell you I was going to ask this, so I'm sorry if I'm putting you on the spot. But I know that you have written a ton about Bush 41, but we're also knew him personally, and we're asked to do a lot of the commentary actually that we were sort of talking about. What was it like trying to bring together someone's life in sometimes a 30-second soundbite, and also with the acknowledgement that everything you said was going to be sort of taken as a judgment on the current moment?
It's a great question, actually, and I appreciate the opportunity for spontaneity.
I'm glad you said that. That's excellent.
Well, let me also begin by saying thank you for hosting us, and especially I'm always thrilled to be introduced by somebody associated with John Marshall, since my son is named Marshall, not coincidentally, and has a picture of John Marshall on his bedroom wall, which, no pressure. In any event, I think talking about George H.W. Bush, having worked with him, and I had a marvelous opportunity we basically co-wrote a book together, and then I was with him a lot as I was researching 10 years worth of his foreign policy. Actually, his foreign policy was 4 years. It took me 10 years to research it. In fact, I used to joke, not around him, but I used to joke that I'm the only one around here who was glad he didn't win a second term, because I don't have another 10 years of my life to devote to this. In any event, I found myself, as I was writing those books about him, having the same thought that I did when I was on TV talking about his funeral, which was whenever I found myself saying, I wonder what the president would think about that sentence, I would stop, because that's not my job. My job is to write what I think about the sentence and what the historical evidence tells me about the sentence. And if I'm thinking about how he is going to receive it as a human being, then I'm clearly not giving the public or the academic community my full attention. And same with when he passed away, that I think you guys are exactly right, that the entire conversation about H.W. Bush's funeral was actually about President Trump. Just the fact that there were so many references to H.W. Bush's military service as a contradiction, obviously, to President Trump never having had a military service, was an easy way for people who wanted to put down the current president to bring up what a previous president had done. Now, I don't want to denigrate President Bush's military service. It was extraordinarily important to his own formation. He was a young man. He actually was the second youngest naval aviator in the Pacific Theater during World War II. By the way, we used to say he was the youngest, and then some other guy popped up. So extraordinarily important for the formation of his thinking. But have I mentioned, he became president of the United States. Like, other things mattered over the course of his life, but that was something that they really focused on, in the same way that while it was not obviously a presidential discussion, if you recall when John McCain passed away and had a de facto state funeral, again, lots of discussion of sacrifice, lots of discussion of military valor by people who I think implicitly and explicitly wanted to have a contemporary discussion about President Trump and did not actually care as much about getting things right about McCain or Bush as they did of making their own political points. And I have to say, to be very clear, this occurred throughout the political spectrum. This is not just a case of liberals on one particular news channel, who you can imagine which one you think, deciding that here's an opportunity to insult the president. This also occurred in other venues as well, much, much more right-wing, much more conservative kind of people who, especially when President Bush died, who you would anticipate would have been enthusiastic supporters of President Trump, also used it as an opportunity to talk about what they thought a virtuous president might be, recognizing, I think, implicitly that Donald Trump was, and maybe will be again, an unusual president. People kind of like usual presidents in some ways. It gives them a sense of comfort. So all of that is a very long-winded answer to say there's no way to think about writing the past, certainly not for someone you knew, but for anyone, without thinking about the contemporary context.
Well, I love that, because in the H.W. Bush chapter, which was written by Warren Finch, who was the former director of the Presidential Library, and he was actually responsible for working with the Bush family and making sure that all of the ceremony around it actually took place, he emphasized that former President Bush actually really wanted, at least in terms of his the exhibits, what was emphasized in the library, wanted that military piece.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that theme of what presidents want to emphasize, what their families want to emphasize, is one that has come up across the volume and across the centuries of American history, that maybe, sometimes presidents have one idea of what their legacy should be, and sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong, and sometimes the families have an idea. So Matt, maybe you could talk a little bit about that theme and some of the other chapters, and we'll kind of work our way through some of them that have come up, and whether either presidents, their plans have gone according to plan, or families' input, any of those things.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think it makes sense to start with the first, that being George Washington. Washington passed away at Mount Vernon in 1799, December 1799. And, he gave pretty direct instructions about his funeral, that he wanted very little pomp and circumstance, that this was really just supposed to be more of a family affair. But George Washington is probably the most famous American in the young United States at that time. And Americans are not going to just let him quietly go into his tomb. And all of a sudden, what they realize is that people start sort of descending upon Mount Vernon. You have local citizens, you have Freemasons, you have veterans, and this becomes a massive funeral. And because news of Washington's death travels so slowly, all of a sudden the news is starting to reach different pockets of the United States. And then all these different states and cities and government councils are planning their own mock funeral celebrations. And this carries over all the way up to Washington's birthday in February 1800. So what we see is, even though he is a former president, it's not really a state funeral as we think of today. We see sort of the early makings of what we would consider when we think about a country in mourning, the passing of a former president, the fact that there is spontaneous and also planned mourning rituals and celebrations happening across the United States. The important thing to keep in mind, though, is that Washington was in many ways, he was the symbolic glue that held many of these different disparate factions and groups together. And with him gone, kind of opens up that question of how are we supposed to mourn our heroes? How should we mourn presidents? I mean, we're on our second president at that point. And the
Who was,
first one,
by the way, really thrilled that there were 3 years of mourning.
I'm sure he was probably used to that mistreatment by then. But Washington sort of sets the mold. But I will also say that all of his predecessors don't quite live up to that symbolic stature. And it would take some time, I would say probably until there's a sitting president of the United States dying in office. Then you'll see funerals that are sort of comparable to Washington's. But everyone in between, they're relatively small. They're at family homes, plantations. There could be some local participation, but you just don't see the national outpouring of grief. Maybe the exception is Adams and Jefferson in 1826, just because it's very symbolic of the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. But until we start seeing presidents die in office, that's when we start to see some of those customs really take root.
Well, and even then, I mean, some of the early presidents that die in office, when we think of like William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, there is a celebration and they're in the White House. And so there is the mourning custom, but it's not the same outpouring. It's not the same national experience. I think that doesn't really happen until Lincoln. And that, of course, was such a unique moment in American history, partly because of the timing. He was shot on Good Friday. He died in between Good Friday and Easter. The war was basically just at an end. There was the symbolism of the religious sacrifice in a very Christian nation at that point. It was the first assassination, and Lincoln himself had said, Americans don't really do that. That's not how we express our grievance. So it was such a shocking moment. It was such a traumatic moment that I think that really started to catapult what it meant to have national loss after Washington. And, I think the next time there have been several other moments that have replicated that. Off the top of my head. I think of, FDR and Kennedy and some of those. And I don't know if you want to jump there.
Yeah, Kennedy especially. And I think one of the lessons that I take from this marvelous book that they've put together is both an obvious one and a critically important one, which is that no matter how much a president prepares for their own funeral, by the way, some of them do not. Lincoln did not. Kennedy did not. You can see the theme here. But even the ones who leave office and prepare for their own funeral followed Washington's model in the sense that the moment that they die, they're no longer in charge. And their memory is manipulated and used by people, even their own families, to say, well, I understand that this is what the old guy wanted. I can read his handwriting. This is what he wanted. We're not doing that. And it really gives you a good sense of the finality, if you will, of death in many ways. And I do have to say one funny anecdote from my own experience watching President Bush with this. There was one point where he and I had a meeting that was right after the meeting where they were reordering the seating chart at his funeral, which they did every few months or so. And I said to him, is that weird? I mean, talking about your own funeral, but also being involved in the funeral to that level of detail. And, most people don't get into that level of detail for their funeral. And he looked at me and said, when you do it every month, it gets kind of used to it. So, okay.
Not to take us on another tangent, but my favorite anecdote from that chapter is they were having one of these meetings and trying to figure out, they had determined that the family and the casket was going to be carried by this special train, because he loved trains. special train to College Station, and they were planning the menu for the people that were on the train. And they asked him, what do you want to be served? And he's like, well, what do you want to be served? I'm not going to be eating. I don't care. Which
Is there a vegetarian option?
which I think,
this was College Station. There's no vegetarian option.
which I think, I guess if you happen to be meeting every month, a sense of humor about it is a good place to begin. I think that the Kennedy example brings up another pretty interesting dynamic, which is, to your point, that the Camelot concept was something that was actually a creation after he passed away. But the response to Kennedy's death and the chapter by Dr. Sharon Conrad is excellent, and it looks at the memory of Kennedy in the Black community and how different that was from a lot of other Americans, and why. And so that actually is one of the pillars of the volume, is how do different communities remember people differently? How do their different experiences shape their memory and their mourning, and how are they able to craft their own legacy or to try and craft the president's legacy? So the Kennedy example is a great one, where they really felt that he had been assassinated for them, for civil rights. And Sharon does an amazing job bringing in material culture items that demonstrate that commitment, in that a lot of families had pictures of Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and they were often next to either Lincoln or Jesus. And so it was sort of like this trinity of figures.
Or the Pope.
Or the Pope, sure, yeah. And
So no subtlety in this case.
like the Fab Four.
But that's not the only chapter that tackles that. So Matt, do you want to share some of the other?
Yeah, so I think one of the chapter that I think I enjoyed most as an editor, because it really sort of reversed how all of us were really, I think, beginning to approach the idea of mourning a president, was Andrew Davenport's chapter on Thomas Jefferson. Now, if you never heard of Andrew is the manager of the Getting Word Project at Monticello. He is also a Hemmings descendant. And so he approached the memory of Jefferson very differently. He approached it really as a family history, talking about what did Jefferson's death mean to white Americans, but also what did it mean to the people that he enslaved at Monticello? And for them, they wanted Jefferson to stay alive, because if Jefferson was alive, their community stay intact, their families would stay intact. And he talks about an instance where Jefferson gets, I think, hurt in a carriage accident. And he describes that enslaved people were running to greet him when he got there, that they were so happy that he was okay. But Andrew points out that this was a fear that enslaved people live with. If anything happens to our owner, who knows what will happen to our families. And from his own personal story, I mean, it's just a very harrowing, traumatic story about his family being separated, sold, displaced. And but really, it's an interesting twist that now he has come back. He is one of the descendants who now works at Monticello, who is part of this process of talking about Jefferson, his legacy, his paradoxical nature. How could he be the architect of the Declaration of Independence while at the same time, over the course of his life, enslaving 600 people? Well, now you have that voice there to be the voice for those ancestors, but also to talk about Jefferson's legacy. So his chapter, I thought, was particularly interesting because, just to contrast it with my own, I looked at Theodore Roosevelt, and mine dug much more into Roosevelt's own family and then private organizations that wanted to create historic sites related to Theodore Roosevelt, because this was a place that they could encourage civic education, following Roosevelt's principles. And if you've been keeping tabs in the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, which they are constructing out in Medora, North Dakota, we see a repeat. We see this coming back again, where another private institution is stepping forward and then sort of inventing a site to talk about Theodore Roosevelt's legacy of conservation, citizenship, and the principles that guided his life and his presidency.
So just if anyone isn't familiar with the story of what happened after Jefferson's life, his estate was in incredible debt. I think estimates today say it was about $2 million. and the state was immediately basically forced into auctions. So the house was sold off, and then any property was sold off, and that included, I think, 220 maybe enslaved individuals. And some were able to find new owners in the Charlottesville area so they could stay near their families, and others, the vast majority, were sold into the Deep South, and those families were really widely fractured. And so Andrew does a phenomenal job of sort of tracing some of those stories and then pulling them back together, and I think it really is in some ways an inspirational outcome given how dark the story is. But there's also, I think, in your chapter, you do such a nice job of there is this component where, as a society, we have, of course, evolved. Our values have evolved and changed. Who we consider to be citizens, who's included in the American story, has evolved and changed. And so no president is going to look the same under the glare of 2023 as they would look in 1903 or 1803. And families often play a really big role in how they want to update that legacy or maintain that legacy or bring it into the 21st century. And you start your chapter with a story about, I don't know if anyone had seen the statue that was in front of the Natural Museum in New York.
Natural history.
Great, should have thought of that before I started the sentence, but thank you. Natural History Museum, and it's a statue of Roosevelt on horseback, and it has two men standing next to him, and one is supposed to look like a Native American, and one is supposed to look like an African man. And at the time, it was, I don't really know what it was supposed to intend.
I can tell you what it was supposed to intend.
Well, I know what it
wasn't subtle.
looks like now. Is it the same intent now?
I
Okay.
mean, I love this image of this statue because every now and then you can show an image to a large group of students and you know they're going to get it because this one, there's no subtlety. You know, this is Theodore Roosevelt, big white guy on a horse leading other peoples to civilization.
Yeah, so I was going to say, if you look at it now, it really does look like this hierarchy. And the family worked with the museum to try and find a way to contextualize it, to say, you know, can we do an exhibit on it? Can we put up signs? But because of where it was, and it's not like the statue, like some statues have no artistic value. This is a nicely made statue. The artist did a good job. But they couldn't figure out how to contextualize it in front of the museum. And so the family and the museum finally, and the community finally agreed that they didn't want to destroy it, but they are going to send it to the president's library that they're building, where it can be built into a space where it can be contextualized all on one plane in one room. And I think that's such a perfect example of how families have to play a role in this ongoing legacy building, but that we also have to acknowledge that as a society, sometimes we do have to continue to update and evolve.
Well, and I think it also speaks to Jeff's earlier point that a president or former president may very specifically state, I want this or I don't want that. But all that sort of goes out the window when they stop taking breaths of air. And then people make these decisions for them. And Theodore Roosevelt had previously told people that he wasn't interested in statues, that he didn't want anything like that. So this flew in the face of that. It was also done in 1940. So, you know, Roosevelt's been dead for 2 decades. So this is quite removed from his actual passing. Ironically, and it kind of comes up here and there in the chapter, you can almost get a sense of sort of the tension between the current president at that time, who was a different Roosevelt, and all this adulation for Theodore Roosevelt. And I think that rivalry between the Long Island Roosevelts and the Hyde Park Roosevelts is very much there because FDR sides with memorialization efforts for Thomas Jefferson on the tidal basin. It is FDR's push to create that commission because there was a movement to try to put Theodore Roosevelt near the National Mall. And of course, this opened up debate about, well, he just passed away. He's still sort of affiliated with the modern Republican Party. Is he worthy to be in the likes of Washington, Lincoln, et cetera? And so FDR sort of short circuits all of it. And he says, you know, we need to go with somebody who I really like, a Democrat, Thomas Jefferson, and we'll put Jefferson there instead. And so, again, it speaks to not only Roosevelt's own family giving the green light, Edith Roosevelt giving the green light to create the statue, but then also his extended family playing a role in sort of the placement of where this memorialization will take place.
And there's one other element that I think is really important on top of this. Not only were they giving a green light, they were giving the money for it as well. So they were huge benefactors of the Natural History Museum. So it's not as though the Natural History Museum could turn around and say, we'd prefer not to have this interesting statue in front of the Roosevelt Room. So.
And you'll see more and more of these family members too show up at things like cornerstone ceremonies. I mean, sometimes the support didn't necessarily have to be financial, but it was about visibility, right? Being able to give the family stamp of approval for a building project, a statue, a memorial. I mean, then it helps raise additional money if you were going to build anything else around it.
Well, one of the other chapters that I think the family is so important, especially because of his post-presidential life, is the Reagan chapter. The Reagan chapter was written by Chester Patch, and I will say, anyone who reads the Reagan chapter probably knows what's going to happen, and yet I was still in tears when I finished it because it's, I think, just exquisitely written. But because of the way that Reagan, of course, had to spend the last several years of his life, his family was extra essential to that process because they were really making his choices. Was there anything in particular? I know you've thought about Reagan, you've written about Reagan that you want to share?
I mean, the other thing that the Reagan family had to deal with, in some ways the Theodore Roosevelt family had to deal with as well, I think, was their president had become larger than life. And in particular, frankly, during the last couple of years of his life, when it was no longer making public appearances, that actually enhances your image as someone who is larger than life psychologically. And they, I think, did a marvelous job at his funeral of trying to remind people that he was a human being and not just this incredible cultural icon, especially for the Republican Party. And as you probably know, the next Republican debate, if I'm not mistaken, is going to be at the Reagan Library.
The end of the month, right?
This is important because Reagan used to be, up until the days of Trump, Reagan used to be obviously the patron saint of the Republican Party. President Trump does not have nice things to say about Reagan. So it's another example of the split that's going on within that party. But I used to tell my students that the single worst thing you could do would be to watch a presidential debate and take a drink every time somebody said the word Reagan, and especially at the Reagan Library.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I didn't say what they were drinking.
I was going to say, it depends on the beverage.
Yeah, so they can get very caffeinated, a lot of coffee. All of which is to say that one other element that I think comes through in this book beautifully is the way in which the sites for these graves become pilgrimage sites, and also future political sites. So when somebody wants to, a future politician, I don't know, let's say a governor from Florida, decides he wants to run for president and wants to take on the mantle of Reagan, guess where he's going to give that speech? It's not hard to figure out. But again, President Reagan didn't get to decide whether or not a future politician speaks in front of his grave.
Yeah, one of the elements of that chapter that I think starts to culminate is the role of technology in this process, as both a constant and a change over time. So Matt started our conversation with Washington and how the news traveled slowly because it had to go by horseback and, of course, in letter and messenger. And actually, Martha Washington and Tobias Lear, who was Washington's sort of chief of staff-ish, sent a special rider to Philadelphia to let the president at the time know and to let Congress know. And that was the fastest way you could get news traveled at the time. And then when, we had Lincoln, at that point, there was the telegraph. So you had a much more instantaneous spreading of news, and you had the almost much more of like a weekend of national mourning because people knew pretty quickly. And then by the time of Reagan, you had 24-hour news coverage of the processional, of the plane, of the process. And so that has both the constant change in technology is, I think, a theme and how people use that. I suspect whatever our next experience is, social media will play a large role in the commemoration, but also in the documentation. So our presidential library is going to need to capture social media messages to share as part of what the national response was. Do you want to talk about some other technological elements that have shown up?
Sure. So, I mean, this process, I think, especially accelerated with Lincoln because not only are you incorporating the train, which has become the preferred method of long-distance conveyance, but also embalming. And, even though they embalmed Lincoln and I feel like they kept embalming and they kept adding things, they made it part of his return to Springfield. They kept stopping at all of these major cities along the way. In many ways, it was very similar to the route that he took for his 1861 inauguration. And they would stop in these cities, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Chicago, and they would take Lincoln off of the train and they would take him to a public building, City Hall, and they would put him on display, very similar to what we see today in the rotunda of the United States Capitol. And so they extended the mourning period so people could physically go and see the president and see his remains in repose. And so that extended that entire process several weeks. And so then we see this, it's not just about their immediate passing in the news, but now even the mourning process itself is getting longer because of technology. Because not only can people get the news more quickly, but they can plan things over greater distances. They can make these arrangements in real time as opposed to waiting for letters to go back and forth. And then I think, you fast forward to say John F. Kennedy. There's estimates that 95% of Americans were watching that state funeral after the assassination. Could be higher, but I think most people and probably everybody in this room who was alive remembers exactly where they were when they found out when President Kennedy was assassinated. And they probably even remember watching the funeral. And that was because technology was the television. And so that was a way to connect hundreds of millions of Americans and people around the world instantaneously to watch the state funeral. And that was, when we're talking about participation just in terms of the numbers, that has to be the most in history until we get to the age of the internet and social media.
Well, and that, of course, that shapes how we think of it, because most people, I think one of the images that they have of the Kennedy funeral is of Jack saluting his father, and we wouldn't have that visual of the experience if it hadn't been captured on film.
Yes, and I was going to say this also, newsflash, not everything about a 24-hour news cycle is great, especially in our current ecosystem. If, again, recall President H.W. Bush's funeral, which we keep bringing up, not only because it's an important one, but also it happens to be the most recent that we've had to discuss. Think back on if you happen to watch the coverage, or if you happen to watch the funeral itself. He actually had two, but let's talk about the one in the National Cathedral. How much of the conversation and how much the cameras were fixated on the previous presidents. Mm-hmm. Was Hillary Clinton going to acknowledge Donald Trump? Was Michelle Obama going to shake Melania's hand? None of that has anything to do with H.W. Bush, but the current politics continues to drive this discussion. And I think the technology allows for an even more invasive sense of that.
And there was also that great viral moment, wasn't it? H.W.'s service dog.
Yes.
Oh,
right.
Yeah.
And maybe some of you saw that image. But that became like an overnight.
Sully?
I think it was Sully. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now they have a statue. I think they have a statue of Sully at the Presidential Library. But that dog probably had no intention of becoming an icon. I don't want to speak for the dog, but but again, it's another example of how technology has drastically changed how we can connect in real time to not only something that I think is an especially moving moment just as a human, but you're connecting that to these bigger ideas of when we're talking about a loss of a leader, who they were, what they represented. And so seeing something like that, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out with the next station.
So I know Lindsay loves dogs, which is why I'm interjecting with another dog story.
It's permitted.
Yeah, thank you. For H.W. Bush, he had a service dog that was there and trained for any medical emergencies, as some service dogs can be trained. Little known fact, he had a second dog with him, which actually had been Barbara Bush's dog. That dog was nasty. And the dog took it upon itself to protect the president in the last few months of his life, so that the service dog would be there just quietly sitting, checking, is he having a heart attack? Is he having a heart attack? Is he having a heart attack? That's what the service dog does. This other little dog, if anybody got within 3 feet of his wheelchair, would attack. It was really remarkable how the dog knew that was its job. So.
I don't have a good transition from there. Thank you for sharing that. But I got nothing. Well, we want to leave some time for questions. So kind of want to, as a wrap up question for you guys, we saw the volume as it came together piecemeal and read the various chapters, but you kind of got it all at once. And I'm curious what surprised you the most as you were reading.
The drama of several of the chapters, because, spoiler alert, it's a book about mourning the presidents, they all die. And yet, as you point out with Reagan and with others, the drama that can still be drawn out in these stories, I think because it's still living history, I really encourage everyone, not least because we're here in the state of Virginia, to read the chapter about Thomas Jefferson, because it encapsulates all the emotions and the passions that Jefferson brings out for us today and is brilliantly written in doing so. So I think what really impressed me was how the nature of the way we remember funerals, the way we remember presidents through their funerals has evolved also with the course of the presidency. The presidency now is a much bigger institution than it was at first in every way, shape, and form, not least of which is, current president has the ability to destroy all human life just on their own whim. Hopefully they won't, but George Washington never had that. So the sense in which these presidents, as we remember them, become bigger than life, I think is because we see the awesome power that is invested in them. And we also know no person should have that power. And yet we give them that power. So remembering is not just about a person dying. It's almost like a demigod dying at this point.
Well, that was one of the takeaways for me as I was thinking through sort of our relationship as a nation to the president. And one of the questions that I have taken away from it is, are we comfortable with that? Are we comfortable with having these ceremonies, which if you just turned on the television for, George H.W. Bush's ceremony, and then you turned on the ceremony for Queen Elizabeth, we have fewer jewels, but that's about it.
Same.
Fewer robes too.
I would say less cloaks.
Yeah. I mean, I would like the swords, but nonetheless, they look really similar. And I think it's up to every American to decide, because these practices are constantly evolving and changing. It's not a static thing. Is that what we want? And everyone does have a right to think about that and to think about what sort of values do we want to see on display and do we want to see celebrated. And Matt, you alluded that, for the next one, we are going to have another one at some point in the nearish future. And what would you like to see?
Well,
since I know you're being asked.
I was going to say, Jimmy Carter made an announcement about he's no longer going to seek medical treatment. He's going to, consider hospice care moving forward. That was 7 months ago.
Yep.
The guy is just unstoppable.
Well, the reason, what people don't appreciate about Jimmy Carter is that he was literally the most competitive person on the planet. So, when he went into hospice, he turned to the doctor and said, "What's the record for staying in hospice?"
Yeah, and to your point, this is something that I think we talked about, in the 1960s, probably I would imagine as a result of Kennedy's assassination, they've put a much more concerted effort into planning state funerals, not only for the current president, but also former presidents. And believe it or not, Herbert Hoover is the first former president to be afforded those full honors. I think in 1964 is when he passes away. But since then, former presidents have been given the option to have state funerals. And one of the things that I was thinking about when we did the workshop was, is that a good thing? Should former presidents have state funerals? When in theory, a state funeral is for a head of state. No problem with the sitting president of the United States, but should a former president? And then, of course, then it begs the question, well, the fact that we've done this now, what does that tell us about the relationship between presidents and the American people? And, is this a good thing? I don't know. Time will tell. I can say to your Queen Elizabeth example, because somebody asked me this at a different book event, they made a similar comparison. And I said, I would say the key difference here is that presidents and former presidents are guided by precedents and traditions, but they are not bounded by them. So that would be a key distinction there. They could still do everything as George H.W. Bush did, or, I would anticipate President Carter maybe doing things a little bit differently. It's just a question of whether or not, he wants to play into this. His whole career has been, he is this guy from Plains, Georgia, who was able to climb into politics, was able to become president. And he never really liked the pomp and circumstance of the presidency. He sort of shunned it, rejected it, and he continued to do that in his post-presidential life. So the question is, will he continue with that streak and maybe doing something very modest? Or alternatively, will he feel like, everybody talks about me as a post-president and nobody talks about my actual presidency. Mm-hmm. And I want to remind them that I was president of the United States. I mean, I could see that as an alternative because, and I'm sure all of you heard this when the hospice announcement came out, people immediately started talking about Jimmy Carter as the most successful post-president president. How do you think Jimmy Carter felt about that?
So with that, we would love to take your questions. There are 2 microphones, so please raise your hand. We are happy to talk about anything in the volume or presidents in general.
I hear my dad talk about FDR's death. It seemed so personal, like he lost a family member. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for asking that question. We didn't really talk much about FDR, which was an oversight because there's a fantastic FDR chapter by David Woolner, which talks about that very thing, which is that for a lot of Americans, FDR was the only president they remembered because he was in office for so long and in office for the New Deal and the Great Depression and World War II. And so if you were on the younger side, he was really the only president you knew, you had memory of. And so when he died, it was as though a father figure had died. It was as though it was life-shattering, it was earth-shattering because he had been such a stable force. And his mourning process in some ways sort of borrowed from Lincoln's in that he died in Georgia and so took the train up to DC and then to New York, and people lined the tracks on the way to pay their respects. So it was very much a national experience in that way.
And I think, he was the first president, for Americans to really know his voice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he did about 30 fireside chats, but, he talked to the American people through all these crises. And the way that he spoke to people, he was just a born communicator. Mm-hmm. And, the advent of radio, more and more Americans have these things. And to hear the president's voice and to hear him calm them, talk them through these things, prepare them for war, and then all of a sudden to not only lose that leadership, but to lose that voice was pretty traumatic. Roosevelt had told his son that, he did not want a state funeral because, well, the American boys were fighting overseas. He didn't think it was appropriate. It's also part of the reason why for his 4th inauguration, they just do it at the White House. They don't have a formal inauguration. Now, there's also some great stuff in there about his health because, yes, it was a wartime measure, but also Franklin Roosevelt wasn't in great health. In fact, there were doctors that advised him, and one doctor in particular that advised him that he shouldn't seek re-election, but he proceeded anyway. So, all of these things I think tell us more about how Americans respond to the passing of a president in wartime. And also, this is really sort of the first, Americans had fought in global wars before, but a global war where the Americans are really sort of setting the stage for what's to come after the war. And everybody always thought that Roosevelt would be a key part of that conversation.
Roosevelt did.
And to lose that was particularly traumatic.
So when I was reading the George Washington chapter, I thought it was very interesting that after he passed, a lot of memorabilia came out, and when Lincoln passed away, people were lining the shutters at Ford's Theater just to get a piece. Can you talk a little bit more about how like the merchandising and the memorabilia has changed over the presidents over the years?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Zachary Taylor chapter has an interesting piece about the snuff boxes that were produced after his death. And the point of the snuff boxes was that they really presented him as a general, as a wartime hero, because his very short presidency had been so lackluster that they were attempting to find the thing that people were willing to celebrate. But I think that concept of the memorabilia, is something that we have seen from the very beginning, and we still see. We were talking about the Queen. It's a way for people to feel part of the process. It's a way for people to feel a sense of belonging, to feel that they are somehow contributing or to hold on to that. I don't know that was there a lot of stuff around HWs? Was there a lot of memorabilia stuff produced?
Oh yeah. If there's money to be made, stuff will be produced.
That's
But one other thing to note about the changing of the memorabilia, if you will, and the merchandising is it really does, again, demonstrate the way the presidency has changed, but also how we have changed. So, for example, we in our 21st century society do not have the same relationship to dead bodies that people in previous millennia did. So easiest example of this is, go to most medieval churches will have some form of relic. What is the relic? Relic is usually a piece of bone. Maybe the person's, maybe not. We don't know. But the idea of saving a piece of bone and giving other pieces of that person out to other churches will kind of, right, you snicker, we kind of rubs us the wrong way. But again, this was something that was over the course of American history and evolution. So a good example of this is, again, with Lincoln, John Hay, who had been one of his two wartime secretaries during the Civil War, continues to be an extraordinarily important person within Republican Party politics through the rest of his life. Ultimately, it winds up being Secretary of State. John Hay used to give a ring to every successive Republican presidential nominee that had a piece of Lincoln's hair in it. The idea being you need this direct connection. And by the way, that was not uncommon. I mean, people put hairs in rings a lot. And again, we don't typically. So these things do change with the cultural changing as well.
Yeah, Mount Vernon does have a pretty extensive collection of locks of Washington's hair. I always used to joke that if you put them all together, I mean, Washington must have been some kind of Sasquatch. But yeah, I don't. Are they all his hair? Are they all Lincoln's hair? I mean, obviously, our definition of authenticity and provenance has changed. But I think what's more important is the belief, right? Because people were willing to actively pursue these things, purchase these things, produce them, give them as gifts. And I think they all speak to Lindsay's earlier point that it was about owning a piece of history, owning a piece of that president and their legacy. And today we don't necessarily do that with hair or body parts or anything like that, but people can buy commemorative plates, cups, to Jeff's point, if there's money to be made on the tragedy or on the passing, and then if there's Americans to consume it.
There's a question down here in front.
Yes, you've mentioned a couple of the first ladies. I was wanting more information about how they influenced the mourning, either right afterwards or years later.
So of course it depends on the president. Jefferson's wife had died quite some time ago, so his daughter was really sort of the person left. Martha Washington was the one who was trying to implement his wishes, and then the American people had their own say. Mary Lincoln had less of a role than one might anticipate, partly because she was really struck by grief, and partly I think because her Lincoln's cabinet wasn't all that fond of her and sort of sidelined her from that process. some of both, I think, in that way. And in terms of some of the other, I mean, of course, Jacqueline Kennedy was instrumental in shaping every single element of how Kennedy was remembered, and the ceremony and the passing, and even, you know, how she didn't change her clothes when she was on the plane when LBJ took the oath for intentional reasons. And so she was, of course, central to that. And Nancy Reagan is, you know, I think the same. Nancy was really central to ensuring that what Reagan had articulated when he was able to do so came to pass. But she also was trying to craft the image of Reagan and mourning in America. MORNING, Mourning in America, and, you know, ensuring the American people had a role. So I think, you know, first ladies are essential to this process. And Barbara Bush, I think, had no expectation that she would go first. But
That's, I was about to say.
Yeah, but one of the interesting elements of the chapter is that because she did, it almost served as a dress rehearsal, because so many of it was almost just like a slightly reduced version. So they really can't be separated from the story.
And I would just say, generally speaking, you know, the first ladies outlived the presidents, which, I mean, there's a number of different factors that go into that. But they are the ones who typically survive, and they're the ones who are sort of left to, whether they like it or not, to carry on the legacy. And so you'll see, it's not in the chapter, but a great example of this is if you go to DC and you go to the Woodrow Wilson house, the second Mrs. Wilson, Edith Wilson, you know, she continued living in that house, and she was essentially the first curator of all these different things that came from the Wilson presidency. And she lived until the 1960s, might have been 1962, 63. But she was essentially, she kept his room exactly as it was when he lived there. I mean, even like his hair is still in the hairbrush. I mean, again, speaking to like the hair and the, you know, the bodies thing, you know, maybe there's a little change over there. But the fact that she played such a central role in maintaining everything that her husband touched, used, anything that was part of his administration, you know, she played a key role in those decades. And that is not an unusual story. I mean, it usually is the women who are not only thinking about preservation at the moment, but they're also thinking about preserving history for the future. And that's true at the White House too, where usually it's the first ladies who are more concerned about that versus the presidents themselves.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Just wanted, if you had any thoughts on disgraced presidents like Richard Nixon and the service for Richard Nixon with all the living presidents attended.
Well, so I think one of the challenges we had with this chapter is, you know, who to include and who not to include. And so we didn't end up including Nixon, but we did include Hoover. And the parallels are interesting, probably not what Hoover would have wanted, but the parallels are interesting because both were remembered for something during their presidency. You know, Hoover, for I think real conservative ideological reasons, believed that he should not interfere with the Depression. And then, of course, Nixon's resignation. And no matter what they did afterwards or before, that was sort of the one sentence on their, you know, their political legacy. And both tried really, really, really hard to change that and worked really, really, really hard to change that with sort of, I think in Hoover's case, mixed success. And Nixon certainly was, I think, a valued advisor for a lot of people, perhaps behind the scenes. But Nixon elected not to have a lot of the state pomp and circumstance. Whether he was asked not to or personally chose, I can't say. I don't know if you guys know. But he did not have the big showy.
I think it was his preference.
Well, he did have the other presidents there, the other former presidents. And
He just didn't want to be in DC.
Yeah, but, you know, this is really interesting. Obviously, Nixon's legacy is complex, especially for those who run the Nixon Library. When you go to the Nixon Library, and I encourage you to do so, it's a very nice place, they have a foyer which has a couple of different quotes on the high on the walls. You know how that goes. One from Nixon, another from Nixon, but then there's another one from Bill Clinton, from his eulogy that says, and I'm paraphrasing here, "The time to remember Nixon as only a criminal has gone. Let's remember his entire life." So how interesting it is that the words from the eulogy trying to rehabilitate a president at his funeral, by the way, it would be rude to say something rude at his funeral, becomes so important to the mission of the entire institution, it literally gets etched in stone.
Well, I think that's such a great point just to wrap up on, the process of mourning and history should be seen as two different things, because we've all been at a funeral where people are saying glowing things about the person and you're like,
Not the person I knew.
it's not my memory of how
No.
that worked. And the same is true for presidents. You're not going to go look at their family and say this person did awful things. I mean, you might be thinking it, but you're probably not going to say it. And so it is, I think, important that we recognize that it's, part one, and then it will continue to evolve as it should, and the history will continue to be written. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you.
It's been a delight.
So Matt, Lindsay, and Jeff will be out in Commonwealth Hall to sign books. So I hope you all will join us there. Copies are available in the bookstore. Thank you so much for coming.